Can we speed this up? I have a lunch reservation. The words landed in the courtroom like a dropped glass, sharp, careless, loud in their disrespect. Chloe Sutton, 22 years old, sat with one leg crossed, her phone glowing in her hand, scrolling as if she were waiting for a table, not standing before a judge. Her tone wasn't angry. It was worse than that. It was bored, as though the law were customer service and this hearing was running late. Judge Frank Caprio didn't answer right away. He took a slow breath. Then he set his pen down. "Ms. Sutton," he said calmly, "this is a courtroom. Put the phone away and address the charges." She barely looked up. "I'm here. Isn't that enough?" In that moment, this case stopped being about a parking ticket. It became something much larger. Because this wasn't just a young woman accused of misusing a disabled parking space. This was a test of what happens when money grows so loud that it drowns out responsibility. When privilege becomes so familiar, it feels invisible to the person holding it. When someone walks into a public courtroom, believing time rules and consequences bend for them. Judge Caprio had seen thousands of defendants, people who were scared, people who were ashamed, people who were desperate. But every so often someone arrived who didn't fear the system at all, someone who believed the system belonged to them. And those cases mattered. Not because of who the defendant was, but because of who else was affected. People without assistance to handle the mail, parents lifting wheelchairs from vans, officers doing their jobs without donations to hide behind. Before we go any further, take a moment. Ask yourself a simple question. What should justice look like when money thinks it owns the room? If you believe real justice means accountability with humanity and mercy that teaches instead of excuses, consider subscribing to Mercy Stories. Because what happens next isn't about punishment. It's about learning what money can never buy. The trouble began on an ordinary Wednesday morning, the kind of morning most people forget by lunchtime. At 9:42 a.m., a silver luxury sedan pulled up in front of the Hope Street Pharmacy. The engine shut off. The driver stepped out. Chloe Sutton moved with the ease of someone who had never been told no by a locked door or a closed space. She didn't check the sign. She didn't look for a placard. She parked directly in a van-accessible disabled space, clearly marked with the international symbol of access and cross-hatched lines designed for wheelchair ramps. To Chloe, the space looked empty. To someone else, it was essential. Inside the pharmacy, minutes passed. 10, maybe fewer. To Chloe, it was quick, forgettable. But outside that space was no longer doing the job it was designed to do. Parking Enforcement Officer Grace Chen arrived as part of her routine patrol. She saw the vehicle immediately. No handicap plate, no placard, no authorization. She documented the violation, issued the citation, and placed it carefully on the windshield. Standard procedure, no drama, no confrontation. At 9:53 a.m., Chloe exited the pharmacy. What happened next mattered more than the parking itself. Instead of pausing, instead of reading the citation, Chloe tore it in half. She dropped the pieces onto the sidewalk like trash. When Officer Chen approached to explain the violation, Chloe didn't apologize. She didn't ask a question. She laughed it off. "This is ridiculous," she said. Then she added the sentence that would echo through the courtroom weeks later. "Do you know who I am? My family funds this city." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. To Officer Chen, it sounded like leverage, like a reminder, like a warning wrapped in wealth. And this wasn't the first time Chloe had spoken this way. Judge Caprio would later uncover a prior warning from campus parking enforcement at Brown University 14 months earlier. Chloe had blocked a loading zone during a food delivery. When confronted, she reportedly dismissed the officer with a familiar phrase, "My family donated the library." No citation that time, just a warning. And warnings, when ignored, don't disappear. They turn into patterns. Back on Hope Street, Chloe drove away believing the matter was finished. But it wasn't. Because this wasn't just about where she parked. It was about what her choice denied someone else. At 9:51 a.m., a mother named Sarah Bennett arrived at the same pharmacy with her daughter, who uses a wheelchair due to cerebral palsy. The van-accessible space was blocked. Without it, the side ramp could not deploy. There was nowhere else to park that allowed safe entry. They waited, they searched, they improvised. By the time they got inside, the therapy window was gone. For Chloe, it was 10 minutes. For Sarah's daughter, it was a missed medical session that couldn't be replaced. And still, Chloe ignored what came next. 3 summons notices were mailed to her residence, certified, signed for, one after another. Weeks passed. No response, no appearance, no acknowledgement. When asked later, Chloe would say, "My assistant handles the mail." But the record showed something different. Each notice had been received. Each one had been ignored. What stood before Judge Caprio was not a single lapse in judgment. It was a sequence of choices, each one reinforcing the last. A belief that rules were flexible, that consequences were optional, that money softened edges others had to live with. And now that belief was about to be tested. By the time Chloe Sutton returned to court, the issue was no longer a parking violation. It was her attitude toward the process itself. She arrived late, sat down casually, one leg crossed, phone in hand. Her lawyer, Diana Hale, stood ready to do what she had clearly done many times before, end the problem with a check. "Your Honor," Hale said smoothly, "my client is prepared to pay all applicable fines and resolve this matter today." Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He simply said, "Ms. Hale, sit down. This court is not a payment portal." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Because Judge Caprio wasn't interested in how quickly this could be made to disappear. He wanted to understand how it happened, and more importantly, why it kept happening. He turned to the clerk, then to the officer. The record began to unfold line by line, fact by fact. 3 summons notices, certified mail, signed 4 at the defendant's address. When Judge Caprio asked Chloe directly whether she had received them, she hesitated. "My assistant handles the mail. That's not what I asked." The judge replied, "Did you receive them?" "I guess," she said. "You guessed," Caprio repeated, glancing toward the clerk. The confirmation was clear. Delivery verified, multiple times, over several weeks. This wasn't confusion, it was avoidance. Then the courtroom shifted. Judge Caprio introduced a written statement into the record. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional language, it was precise. The statement belonged to Sarah Bennett, the mother who had arrived at the pharmacy minutes after Chloe left. Judge Caprio read one line aloud. "The ramp could not deploy. My daughter missed her therapy window." Chloe waved her hand dismissively. "That's not my fault," she said. "She could have parked somewhere else." The room changed at that moment. Her attorney objected quickly, calling the context emotional. Judge Caprio stopped her mid-sentence. "Counselor," he said calmly, "denial of access is a material fact. This is not emotion. This is harm." Then he turned to Officer Grace Chen. "Officer, please read your narrative for the record." Officer Chen stepped forward, steady and professional. She described what she saw: the marked van-accessible space, the absence of authorization, the citation, the moment Chloe tore it up and threw it away, and then the words. "This is ridiculous. Do you know who I am?" "My family funds this city." Judge Caprio asked a simple question. "Officer Chen, did you perceive that statement as intimidation?" "Yes, Your Honor." Chloe leaned forward, clearly irritated now. "It was sarcasm. I was annoyed." "Let's listen," Judge Caprio said. The body camera audio played. Chloe's voice came through clearly. Flat. Confident. Unapologetic. "My family funds this city." No laughter, no joking tone, just certainty. Judge Caprio waited, then asked Chloe something else. "What did you mean by that?" "I meant we support the community." Officer Chen was asked how she interpreted it. "As leverage," she answered. "As an implied consequence for writing the ticket." That was when Judge Caprio said the sentence that reframed the entire hearing. "Sarcasm doesn't deploy ramps, Ms. Sutton." And then came something Chloe hadn't expected. The clerk was asked to read a log. Calls, emails, voicemails, all from numbers connected to Sutton Holdings, all within minutes of the citation being issued. A request for a quiet resolution. Chloe shifted in her seat. "I didn't ask them to call." "Maybe not," Judge Caprio replied evenly. "But someone thought it would help." He laid out the timeline slowly so no one could miss it. Citation at 9:42 a.m., first call at 10:18, email before 11. "That's 36 minutes, he said. Someone moved fast. The courtroom was no longer watching a traffic case. They were watching a system being tested. And it was about to reach its breaking point. There are moments in a courtroom when the air changes. Not because someone raises their voice, not because a gavel slams, but because a truth surfaces that can no longer be ignored. Judge Caprio sat back slightly and looked at Chloe Sutton, not with anger, but with clarity. He had listened long enough. Now he began to connect the pieces slowly, deliberately, so everyone in the room could follow. "This court keeps a log," he said, turning to the clerk. "Any communication related to an active case. Calls, emails, voicemails." He paused. "Read them." The clerk adjusted her glasses and began. 2 incoming calls and 1 voicemail, all from a number registered to Sutton Holdings Donor Relations. Chloe stiffened. The timestamps followed: 10:18 a.m., 10:47 a.m., an email at 10:52. The subject line was read aloud word for word. "Docket 24-10847. Resolution." The message was polite, polished, familiar to anyone who had ever watched influence work quietly behind closed doors. Given the family's long-standing support for civic initiatives, we would like to discuss options for resolving this quietly and efficiently. Before the clerk could finish, Chloe's attorney was on her feet. Your Honor, my client is not responsible for communications from her mother's foundation. This is irrelevant. Judge Caprio didn't hesitate. Overruled, he said. Pressures on process are relevant when they're logged. I'm not accusing anyone of criminal conduct. I'm documenting facts. He turned back to Chloe. I'm going to lay out a timeline, he said calmly. Citation issued at 9:42 a.m. First call at 10:18. That's 36 minutes. Email before 11. Someone moved fast. Chloe shook her head. I didn't ask them to call. Maybe not, Caprio replied. But someone believed it would help. That sentence lingered. Then Judge Caprio did something unexpected. He asked the clerk to place a call. Is Ms. Sarah Bennett available to give a brief statement? She was. Her voice came through the speaker, steady, restrained, carrying the fatigue of someone who had explained this before and shouldn't have to explain it again. My daughter has cerebral palsy, she said. She receives physical therapy twice a week. Wednesday was a critical session. We arrived at the pharmacy at 9:51. The van accessible space was blocked. I couldn't lower the side ramp. By the time we found another spot and got inside, we missed the therapy window. She paused. Access is infrastructure. It's not optional. Chloe muttered something under her breath. Judge Caprio caught it. Ms. Sutton, he said evenly, if you have something to say it clearly. It was 10 minutes, Chloe replied. 10 minutes, Caprio repeated, is a therapy window. When the line disconnected, the courtroom was silent. Then Chloe did what privilege sometimes does when it feels cornered. She leaned forward. This is absurd, she said, her voice rising. My family has donated millions to the city. We fund programs. We support infrastructure. You wouldn't have half your budget without us. The sentence crossed a line. Judge Caprio looked at her, not sharply, not coldly, but with something firmer than anger. Ms. Sutton, he said, donations don't purchase exemptions. They should purchase some respect. She shot back. Do you know how much my mother contributes? Your salary is paid by taxpayers like us. Her attorney stood up quickly. Your Honor, my client is... Chloe interrupted her. I own you. The words hung in the courtroom didn't react right away. No gasps, no whispers, just silence. 5 seconds passed, then 7, then 10. In that quiet space, the sentence Chloe Sutton had spoken lost all the power she believed it carried. Judge Frank Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike the gavel. He didn't lean forward like a man asserting dominance. Instead, he waited long enough for Chloe to feel what she had done, long enough for the room to understand that something irreversible had just happened. Then he spoke. Miss Sutton, he said calmly, you own nothing in this courtroom. Not the process, not the outcome, and certainly not me. The words were not sharp, they were final. Judge Caprio turned to the record. Here is my finding. He went point by point, steady and precise. The evidence supports all 4 charges. Unauthorized use of a disabled and van-accessible parking space. Destruction of a lawful citation. Failure to appear on 3 summons notices. And conduct reasonably perceived by a public officer as intimidation. He paused, letting each charge settle. Officer Chen's narrative is credible and corroborated by body camera audio. Photographic evidence, the torn citation, certified mail confirmations, and a documented timeline of donor-related communications. This was not opinion. It was fact. Judge Caprio looked back at Chloe. This court does not weigh cases based on wealth or donations, he said. Borrowed money is not borrowed authority. Your mother's philanthropy does not grant you ownership of public process. Status does not erase harm. Then he said the line that reframed everything. Access is not for auction. The base fines were listed plainly. $750 in total. Unauthorized use of a disabled bay. Contempt for failure to appear. Administrative fees. Chloe exhaled as if preparing to pay and leave. Judge Caprio raised a hand. I'm not finished. He explained that $400 of that total would be stayed contingent on full compliance with a restorative accountability plan. Not reduced, not forgiven, held in trust. Mercy, he said, isn't a discount, it's a contract. Then he laid out the plan. Written apologies, real ones. In Chloe's own words, to Officer Grace Chen and to Sarah Bennett. 150 hours of community service. Half at the Rhode Island Food Bank. Half with the Mobility Access Coalition, assisting with accessibility audits. No publicity. No photo opportunities. 2 public service announcements court reviewed for school distribution. On access equity and the difference between charity and entitlement. Completion of a donor influence. ethics module learning where philanthropy ends and public process begins. And finally, a 900-word written reflection titled Money versus Authority. No slogans, no branding, just truth. Judge Caprio set his pen down. If you complete this, he said, the state amount is remitted. If you don't, it returns in full. He looked directly at her. This is accountability with mercy. The choice is yours. The courtroom remained quiet, not because justice had been harsh, but because it had been exact. Change doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in resistance, in repetition, in quiet moments when no one is watching. For Chloe Sutton, the first apology didn't pass. The court sent it back. Too polished, the note read, clearly written by someone else. So she tried again, this time in her own words. She showed up to the Rhode Island Food Bank without cameras or announcements. She sorted donations, stocked shelves, lifted boxes beside people who didn't know her last name and didn't care. At the Mobility Access Coalition, she learned measurements she'd never thought about before: ramp angles, clearance widths, door swings. One wheelchair user looked at her and said something that stayed with her. Access isn't a favor, he said, it's a right. Officer Grace Chen agreed to meet her. The conversation was brief and honest. When you said your family funds the city, Chen told her, you made me feel like my job was for sale. It isn't. Sarah Bennett declined a meeting but accepted the letter. She later emailed the court. She named what she took from us. The message read, that's enough. Weeks passed. Hours were logged. The first drafts of the public service announcements were rejected, too corporate, too distant. Chloe recorded them again. No branding, no family name, just her voice explaining the difference between charity and entitlement. The second versions were approved. The ethics module took longer than expected, not because it was difficult, but because it was uncomfortable. It asked questions Chloe had never needed to answer before. Where does generosity end? Where does influence begin? What happens when the two blur? 12 weeks after the original hearing, Chloe returned to court alone. No attorney, no family representative. Judge Caprio reviewed the file, the apologies, the service logs, the certificates, the reflection. Summarize it, he said. No script. Chloe stood. I thought money meant access, she said. I thought because my family donated, I could ignore rules and skip consequences. I thought we fund this meant I own this. I was wrong. She paused. I don't own anything except my own choices. Judge Caprio nodded. You stopped trying to own the system, he said, and started learning how to respect it. He remitted most of the stayed fine and set a payment plan for the remainder. As a reminder, he said, access is not for auction. 5 months later, the effects reached beyond one case. The court published its first influence log. A donor contact firewall was adopted citywide. A tow-first policy for disabled bays reduced complaints. The municipal PSA series launched in local schools, Chloe's recordings included. Not viral, but used. A parent wrote to the court. My son watched the video, the email said. We had a real conversation about access being a right. Thank you. On a quiet Friday afternoon, Judge Caprio finished his last case. Before leaving, he wrote a sentence on a note card and pinned it where he could see it. Public offices are not for sale, they are for service. He turned off the light and locked the door.